different. So we have, sorry, surprise. We have a different Alexander than one listed, is Alexandra Finch, who is affiliated with the O'Neill Institute, also at Georgetown. She's an associate there, and also an adjunct professor at Georgetown. Then to Alex's left, we have Josh Sarnoff, a professor of law at DePaul University in Chicago, and online, we have Pedro Villarreal, who's an associate at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. So again, thank you all so much for taking the time to do this. I really look forward to the discussion. I'm just going to throw a few questions to our speakers at the end. I'll make sure to have some time left for the audience or those attending online to also weigh in and chime in with questions or comments. But for now, I'm just going to get us started under this broad umbrella, the World Together, or World Apart, Pandemic Prevention, Preparedness, and Response is law of the powerless. And I'm going to just ask everybody to intervene, maybe starting with Josh, and then we can come this way and go online to Pedro last. But we just came out probably of a pandemic, and there's a lot of legal and policy initiatives underway. Hopefully, aimed at having us prepare better, right, and respond better. Should we, and as we think we will, right, have to face a transborder large public health crisis in the near future. So if you could, and again, also highlight how you come to encounter these problems and what worries you, what's your work. So if you could start from, that individual perspective, how you fit into this idea of thinking about pandemic preparedness. Maybe we'll start there, and then once we talk about, what you're looking for in terms of the debate that's being framed, and we'll hone in on the negotiations underway for the pandemic preparedness accord. So, Judge, if I could start with you then.
Sure. Thanks, Anna, and it's a delight to be here with my fellow panelists. I got here by airplane, but let me, since it's kind of appropriate that this is hosted by Avila, because most of you, I'm guessing, have heard of the Peace of Westphalia. Yes. And we're dealing with a system of national sovereignty, and that's really a continuing problem. I come at this issue from having done intellectual property work for a long time, starting with access to medicines concerns, but basically patent law scholar, more recently focused on trade secrecy issues and contractual leveraging issues. But I was also an environmental lawyer for a long time. So one of the things that's nice is that there's been an increasing recognition of the development of pandemic disease from nature, including the concerns of climate. So while we have to worry about the loss of our cocoa fields, and thankfully people are working on synthetic chocolate, what we don't have is yet any adequate system for dealing with diseases that you get from chicken tenders. So the nice thing again about the pandemic is it actually shows the failures of the international system of national sovereignty. I think we're seeing that in all sorts of areas, particularly the concerns that countries are having right now with national security, has larger crowds in other rooms. But in any event, the thing that really drove me to get involved was that we knew from the access to medicines background that companies do not willingly and voluntarily share their technology for gearing up. We know that because of competitive concerns in large part. And we also know that countries are willing to control their own industries to do things like prevent them from exporting for worldwide public benefit. So trying to figure out how to develop an innovation system worldwide that would actually generate the worldwide outputs that we want, given the structures of national sovereignty that exist, is kind of what really piqued my interest. And I just happen to do it in the areas of intellectual property. It's probably enough about me, and we can move on.
Hi everyone, my name is Alex, for those of you who didn't catch it. So I'm an associate at the O'Neill Institute, so we deal a lot with global health law issues, and we've been sort of following along with WHO from the get-go, and we're also hosting the Secretariat for a panel for a Global Public Health Convention, which has been advocating a pandemic treaty since day dot, essentially. So I think just one of the take-homes that I'm going to leave you with today is the idea, we often talk about the COVID pandemic as it is once in a century kind of event, it's a catastrophic event, and it did precipitate a lot of the reforms we're going to talk about today, but it's really not that rare. So we know pandemic zoonoses are emerging with increasing frequency or increasing severity, and if anything, the Mpox outbreak at the moment, the epicenter is in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, but it's throughout Africa. It's really a signal about how urgent these reforms are, how little the existing international system is really working to prevent and respond to pandemics.
Hi everyone, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Amazing. So thank you so much for coming today. My name is Matthew Carvalho. I'm a fellow for global governance and diplomacy at the Sunway Center for Planetary Health in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, but I'm actually based in Washington, D.C., also at Georgetown University. So I think the introduction that I kind of wanted to give is, as Anna said, the Global Health Law Committee for AVILA is newly minted. And I think that's really pertinent because 4 or 5 years ago, I don't even think we would get a panel at International Law Weekend. And I think that's pertinent because then COVID happened and we kicked off some of, I think, the fastest negotiations we've seen in the multilateral space. Just to put it in perspective, the Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction Agreement that was adopted in 2023, that was a 20-year process. There were 5 different intergovernmental conferences, 5+, I think, actually, in order to bring that into reality. And we're still seeing the negotiations for even that happen. So I think it's important to note just how quickly these negotiations are occurring. And I think one of the reasons for that is to try to keep up this momentum that we're seeing of the threat that's placed to global health in relation to pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response. And the reason we named the panel The World Together or A World Apart is because the World Health Assembly resolution from the special session that kicked off the pandemic accord negotiations was actually labeled The World Together. And it's very pertinent because, if anything, these negotiations have tested if the international global health community is together or is apart. We've been able to try to operationalize, I think, a lot of social principles, in particular looking at equity, which I think we're going to talk a lot about today during this session. But I think it shows the collective action that global health can have and where we might be able to go. So I look forward to the panel, I look forward to the session, and I think I will pass it over to Pedro on Zoom.
Yes, thank you so much, Matthew, and it's a pleasure to join all of you here today online. I'm Pedro Villarreal, Senior Research Fellow at the Max Planck Institute for Comparative Public Law and International Law, and at the German Institute for International Security Affairs, currently based in Berlin, but originally from Mexico. I am Mexican lawyer trained in Mexico, but due to ongoing projects here in Germany, I am based at these institutions. And what I could say, building up on what the previous speakers have already stated, that indeed we are close to the final phase, apparently the final phase of the negotiations for a pandemic agreement. And we already witnessed the approval of new amendments to the international health regulations, though there will be an overhaul of the rules-based pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response for the next decades. But in my case, so I can mention on the one hand that I'm also a member of the Global Health Law Committee of the International Law Association representing Germany. And we saw, of course, a rise in the interest on the field because of the COVID-19 pandemic. In my case, I can say that my first contact, so to say, with the subject was during the H1N1 influenza pandemic of 2009, which, as you may remember, initially this first zoonotic spillover occurred in Mexico, and that's where a number of legal questions already emerged. And I must admit, maybe due to the mild nature of that pandemic already 15 years ago, several bigger questions that we should have posed back then were not posed. We did not learn many lessons back then, and we witness the consequences of not learning those lessons during the COVID-19 pandemic. For instance, as Professor Sanov already mentioned, we already knew that intellectual property rights might be important obstacles for a more effective pandemic response. We already witnessed the role that zoonotic spillovers could play in triggering global catastrophic events like the COVID-19, but again, during the H1N1 influenza pandemic in 2009, the world moved on, and I do hope that this is not the case now after the COVID-19 pandemic. And I can gladly share my views on the ongoing negotiations for a pandemic agreement, where I have had the pleasure to provide advice to both the German government, the Mexican government, and the WHO. Looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Pedro. And if I could actually stick with you for a second, because I think a good segue into the ongoing negotiations would be for us to talk a little bit about the process and just frame how this began. So we're probably all lawyers in this room, or quasi lawyers in perhaps some cases, but a lot of this is a matter of building legal infrastructure and populating that infrastructure. And we saw a number of things unfolding during the pandemic, attempts at waivers, right, of intellectual property rights, discussing that as a way to facilitate scaling up the production of pharmaceuticals we really needed, and distributing them perhaps more equitably, the one pathway of patent pools and the like. So I would think of those as, legal infrastructure we're developing, but certainly one of the things we're here to discuss today is the pandemic report. And given your role in that, Pedro, I would just invite you to maybe, kickstart that discussion. If you could just provide from a procedural perspective and, from a participatory perspective, just, how it came about and how it's been to be involved in it. And then I'll just come to our panelists here in the room for, a couple of follow-up questions.
Yes, certainly. So I sorry didn't get the last part of the question, but I understand that considering or concerning the procedural questions, right, on related to the negotiations. Well, in the current phase, as you may all know, in December 2021, the WHO approved an unprecedented resolution that triggered the negotiations for a new pandemic agreement on or other legal instrument that back then the option for a non-binding instrument was on the table and couldn't be fully discarded yet, but that's a different story. And in the current phase, so the so-called intergovernmental negotiating body, a group of delegates from different WHO member states, those able and willing to participate, are drafting the text that will be presented to the World Health Assembly for its adoption. And this text will be and is expected to be adopted on the basis of Article 19 of the Constitution of the World Health Organization, itself an international treaty that stipulates that whenever the World Health Assembly adopts a treaty, convention, or agreement under Article 19, and further ratification processes will be needed by states so that these agreements, conventions, or treaties can enter into force for them. Now, the way things look, we see that there will be a next meeting, the 11th meeting, if I'm not mistaken, of this intergovernmental negotiating body in November. The original deadline for finalizing this pandemic agreement was the last May 2024 at the World Health Assembly, but the deadline had to be extended because there are key issues, there are key contentious issues where delegates simply do not reach consensus. And the current new deadline is May 2025, but there is some hope that there might be a breakthrough in the negotiations so that in December this year, it is possible that the World Health Organization will call for a special session of the World Health Assembly where all the delegates of member states meet and vote upon important issues like the pandemic agreement. So I think this gives you more or less an overview of procedural issues, and let us all remember that this agreement is negotiated under the principle nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. So even those aspects that seem to have reached consensus between states may be revisited in the coming months. So again, there's still a degree of uncertainty regarding the next steps in getting this agreement to the finish line. I hope that answers the question. Thank you.
Sure, and we might come back to you just for, some more details on the ongoing process, but I will turn it back to Matt. So from your vantage point, how do you assess the moment we're present at? So we heard the word contentious, right? You already framed this as, a catalytic moment, right? COVID-19 sparkling these kinds of negotiations. So I guess I'm asking the water glass question, half full, half empty. How do you view this? And then I'll extend the question to the other panelists.
Well, I'll start with something that my boss says, is that she's a continuous optimist in every potential situation. And when you work in fields like this, frankly, you have to be to a certain extent. What I want to start with actually is something that I think doesn't always get the attention that it deserves, and I think is really important. When the international health regulations, the amendments to them were adopted during the World Health Assembly this past May, there was a lot of discussion at the Assembly about both the intergovernmental negotiating body for the pandemic agreement, but also the working group on the international health regulations and the actual decoupling of those negotiations to try to get the international health regulation through, which is what ended up happening during the Assembly. And I think some people saw that as a good thing. Some people saw it as really positive. Some people didn't. And I think looking at how the working group on the international health regulations has functioned, I think we ought to take a moment to celebrate what that is and what that moment was that those amendments have gotten through. We now have a pandemic emergency that can be declared by the World Health Organization, which is really, really pertinent in trying to move forward an equity-based approach as we continue with the pandemic agreement negotiations. And on that front, I think it also elicited a moment to look at the actual negotiators who were doing this. There are hundreds, if not more, public servants who have been negotiating tirelessly for the last 2-3 years to try to get these negotiations through. And I think that's a really optimistic moment that we see countries committed to this. Even the United States, which I would say has had nuanced perspectives to engaging with the multilateral space over the last few years, has been really, really committed to engaging with this process. And I see that as a moment for hope to a certain extent. And I hope to continue seeing that with the pandemic accord negotiations that continue. I think there's a reason that we still have contentious issues there because they're really, really important, in particular for low and middle income countries. And low and middle income countries have given up a lot during these negotiations in the sake of trying to bring together solidarity for global health. And the fact that these issues are still there proves how pertinent and important they are to make sure that no one is left behind from a public health perspective. So I think it's actually really important and significant and powerful that we have these contentious issues still being discussed, that they haven't just been, completely dropped and we tried to get everything through at the World Health Assembly. The fact that these are continuing shows that people are committed to moving this forward. And as Anna was saying as well, that the legal infrastructure that's being built will hopefully have a lot of positive successes for global health moving forward.
Thanks to my panelists for setting that up really well. I suppose if Matthew's given the optimistic perspective, I probably have to be the foil and provide a bit of healthy pessimism, I suppose. There is a big push at the moment, particularly from the Director General, members of the Bureau, and members of the Africa Group to really finalise the agreement. And so the deadline for agreeing to have a special session is the halfway point in the second week of negotiations by NB12. So November 12th is the date where they have to say, yes, we can get this agreement over the line or not. One of the challenges there is, well, there's a number of entrenched issues that governments haven't been able to shift on too far. And it's based on a little bit of distrust, particularly from countries in the global south during the COVID pandemic, where they saw this inability to access an equitable amount of medical countermeasures. And those issues are unfortunately playing out in the mpox outbreak, where, you know, even though we adopted the international health regulation amendments, they haven't actually come into force yet. They're not going to come in until the end of next year. So we've got a kind of similar situation playing out in this outbreak, where you've got a number of resources that sort of stockpile in high-income countries and low-income countries having to rely on the charity of those countries to deliver things. So there's a number of lines in the sand that need to budge a little bit if we're actually going to get a solid agreement that does live up to that leave no one behind standard. And unfortunately, they are really baked in at the moment. So there has to be a little bit of give from countries like both global north countries and global south countries for that to happen. But in order for them to reach agreement, there needs to be an acknowledgement of that deep mistrust that happened in the COVID pandemic. The red lines are really on things that fall outside of the scope of the IHR, for instance. So the IHR has a little bit more of a limited scope. It's preparedness and response to public health emergencies of international concern. And the pandemic treaty kind of goes a little bit broader than that. They look at what are the conditions that drive pandemics to emerge in the first place, you know, with the interactions between animals and humans and environmental ecosystems, so the emergence of zoonotic diseases, right through to what happens when this public health emergency affects everybody. It becomes pandemic level. So we're looking at that end of the scale about the global equitable distribution of tools, things like diversifying manufacturing of medical countermeasures, things like technology transfer with or without conditions, and then a system of pathogen accident and benefit sharing, which I think we're going to dive into in a little bit more detail. And so there's serious red lines around that. And there's also a serious red line about how much of this agreement can we put in the primary agreement itself. If we're going to meet this deadline, then there can potentially be all of this additional detail in there. But certain countries, particularly in the Africa Group, want to see quite a lot of detail in there, so they know that there's going to be an assurance on a percentage of medical countermeasures. We're going to see some compulsory technology transfer. There's some red lines there. So there's a question about how much is achievable in the time. But if what is achievable is a lower standard, or we'll just recreate the conditions that led to COVID-19 being the inequitable catastrophe that it was, then what's the point of trying to agree in this rapid time frame?
So I'll try to give a balanced approach, since you've heard, upside and the downside. And to do that, I just want to take you back to historically a little bit. 5 years ago, COVID wasn't really the issue. And we had a world that really wasn't prepared for it. When COVID hit, the worldwide economy shut down. It wasn't clear that we would have vaccines or therapeutics that would be effective. So there was a real emphasis on technology development and how that was going to happen. And mostly wealthy governments and a few middle-income governments, particularly China, Russia, and India, had the technology and the technology background to make traditional vaccines and traditional therapeutics. So they were able to gear up relatively quickly with their own forms of vaccines and therapeutics. Germany, England, and the US, partnering with some other, mostly European companies and universities, were able to generate some of their things. But The development that was really radical was the mRNA vaccines. And that was based on a technology that had been in development for many years even before that, which was lipid nanoparticle technology, the carriers for the mRNA. And this is stuff that is, much more complicated. It's not small molecule technology. So it's something that almost by the definition of technological sophistication inequity is occurring in the most highly advanced countries only. So the question of whether that technology can and should be transferred to other countries, as well as the products of that technology, became a salient issue, including the fact that you needed really significant cold storage to move it to many of the places that you wanted to. And that required public health systems that by and large don't exist, which is an even longer story of global health inequity, colonialism, differential incomes, trade patterns, etc. So all of this gets caught up in a historical rhetoric, which is why I like to start with the Peace of Westphalia, of a dialogue of resentment, I guess is the best way to put it. The thing that's optimistic is, first, everyone has now recognized the need to work together. I think that is beyond question. The consequences of COVID were sufficiently catastrophic. Even with mpox, everyone agrees that we have to work together. The question is going back to the national sovereignty, what government, if there is a limited supply of critical medical countermeasures, is going to send those countermeasures to help other people and reduce either the spread of the disease or the incidence of harm of the disease if it's going to harm their own citizens. They may be out of office very quickly. And that's a problem that we just haven't been able to solve. But these efforts at negotiation are a genuine effort by the world community to try to get there, even though there are serious problems with trying to do so. So again, what are some of the most optimistic things? The first and most optimistic, again, is what Alex has been referring to, is there's been a tremendous focus on the sources of zoonosis and zoonotic disease development, which didn't really have that much of a focus 5 years ago. The second is there's a recognition of the principle of access and benefit sharing coming out of other treaty agreements. It has its own problems, which we'll talk about in a little while. There is the recognition of a need for technology transfer, but not agreement on how it's going to happen. So, but what there is agreement on, which is kind of somewhat surprising, is in order to avoid some of the contentious issues when the crisis arises, there's been an agreement there has to be distributed production, precisely because when a crisis comes, countries simply won't allow the transfer out of needed countermeasures to other countries because they'll be out of office. So you have to have more distributed production, you have to have more rapid scale up of production. All of those principles are trying to come into this agreement in various ways, even if that may not be enough. And even if we have, the elephant not in the room of what happens if the US pulls out of the World Health Organization in January, what happens if countries really start pulling back into nationalist strategies and, there's much more widespread warfare. I mean, all of which is happening at a time where we're going to have massive migration pressures from increasing climate risk, as well as that driving further zoonosis. So the World Health Organization is kind of a microcosm of these world dominating issues in a way that, the goodwill is there, but the willingness of national governments to get past sovereignty is not. And that just creates terrible pressures. So while we send it back to Pedro, if you have any thoughts on, how these world dominating themes come into the negotiations.
Yes, well, thanks so much. May I then jump in?
Yeah.
Thanks, Joshua, for this. Yes, for posing this difficult question, because I do see, and I fully subscribe what you say. I do see that these trends, these global trends, are reflected in the negotiations to the extent that, as you say, we have seen how a backlash against these, what some media have termed a power grab by the WHO, has manifested in multiple countries, where some groups claim that the WHO will take away the sovereign rights of states and will turn into a health police. And this is one signal of this resistance against ceding more, more power to international organizations, to the the resistance against multilateralism more generally, about what's I guess pejoratively termed globalism. And I do believe that the WHO is, of course, not insulated from these trends. It cannot be, right? Let's remember that the main decision-making body of the WHO is the World Health Assembly, where representatives of governments are the ones making the final decision. And of course, these representatives are accountable towards their own populations, and when they go back to their capitals and explained to the population what they did in Geneva, what they approved, they might, of course, have to justify it. And this creates indeed immense pressure upon both the WHO and governments negotiating these agreements in order to really come up with an agreement that is ambitious enough to really make a difference, but that does somehow tread this difficult line between not feeding into this discourse of resistance against globalism and against the empowerment of the WHO, alleged empowerment of the WHO. So I do believe that it's inescapable, right? And we already see this, just to conclude the idea, in one of the provisions of the pandemic agreement. I don't have the number with me here, but where it is explicitly written, even though it wasn't necessary to do it, that the WHO will under no circumstances have the power to mandate national authorities which public health measures to adopt in future pandemics. And this had to be written down in order to appease and to calm down the heated temper of and again the discourse that was spreading across some media that this was a risk, that the WHO would be able to override national sovereignty in future pandemics. This is not the case, but it is a signal that there is a major obstacle to be overcome on this point. Yeah. Thank you.
And speaking of obstacles to be overcome, so on the legal regime side of things, this has popped up a couple times. Access and benefit sharing is perhaps one of the most intense red lines, in my opinion. So could I get the panel's thoughts on this particular approach to technology development and equitable sharing, or where it falls short of the current needs in a probably not a pre-pandemic world, right? With things. So as we hear towards the end of this specific negotiations, so could we talk a little bit about benefit sharing and who wants to go first?
So I'll start off, and briefly before that, if it's okay, I want to talk about something that Pedro brought up in relation to trust in these negotiations, and Alex brought it up as well. It is so pertinent. I was with Pedro about 2 weeks ago in Berlin at the World Health Summit, and the entire theme of the summit was trust and building trust in health. But if you go outside the JW Marriott Hotel Berlin, where the event was happening, you see protesters lining the streets saying, power grab, get out of the WHO, stop the pandemic treaty negotiations. And it was such a dissonant moment for me, because you have a group of global health leaders in a forum trying to figure out how to build trust in health, completely walking past the protesters that they need to build trust with in order to get these things through. So I think there was that moment for me of, I feel like when we work in global health law, and when we engage in global health law, we have a duty to the people to build that literacy and understanding of the functions of the World Health Organization to be able to build that trust to a certain extent. So I thought that was a really pertinent point that I wanted to flag briefly before we get into access and benefit sharing, which I would argue is maybe one of the three most contentious issues still in the negotiation. So under the current draft text, which I think is one of the materials for CLE credit for the panel, there's a provision for a pathogen access and benefit sharing system under the World Health Organization. And the goal of this would be, on one side, timely access to biological materials of pathogens with pandemic potential, and in particular, their genetic sequence data, which I think is a really important point that I'll dive into a little bit. But on the other hand, equitable and rapid sharing of benefits that would come from that, both monetary and non-monetary, but that would look like diagnostics, therapeutics, vaccines, things to really help defend against a pandemic. And this has been really significant, in particular in the developing age that we're seeing. It's not just, sharing physical viral samples with the World Health Organization. We actually see digital sequencing information becoming really, really important in this space, where you can actually navigate the digital world of access and benefit sharing. And there's been a real concern that on that front, because of the internet, they're basically researchers and companies developing, say, vaccines and therapeutics are basically getting this information for free to a certain extent. And it's actually been really pertinent negotiations right now happening at the UN Biodiversity Summit in Cali, Colombia, looking around how to govern digital sequence information and how to engage on that front, because under the Nagoya Protocol of the Convention on Biological Diversity, in order for something like the pathogen access and benefit sharing system to actually develop, it's intended to be a specialized international instrument, and there's certain potential fragmentation there that has to be determined. If the World Health Assembly and the negotiating member states just say it's a specialized instrument, is that enough? Do you have to engage with the Biodiversity Convention? And there's been some historical precedent, I think, for that at the World Health Organization itself. So I think one of the things that has made this really contentious is you're not just relying on member state negotiators, you're relying on member state negotiators to pressure and work with the private sector in a way we haven't necessarily seen before in an effective manner, which is what Josh was alluding to before, where we've seen this level of distrust and this level of almost self-preservation from high-income countries to hoard therapeutics and vaccines out of concern that they may not have enough or need more for their constituents. But on that point, I think I'd like to pass it over to Alex to discuss a bit more on that front, because I think in watching the PABS negotiations, it has shown, I think it's been a real test of just how critical, but how difficult access and benefit sharing provisions are within international law for global health. And I would really love to hear your thoughts on how that's progressed and maybe some lessons that we've seen as these PABS negotiations have gone on.
Thank you so much, Matt. Yeah, they are really contentious. I think the PABS system, just for context, how it is envisioned loosely to work, is that it would be essentially a multilateral pool of pathogen information, including both physical pathogen samples, but also digital sequence information, so kind of codes you can download. So laboratories around the world would ostensibly provide this information to the PABS system, and then manufacturers would go ahead and build stuff with them, so like vaccines, therapeutics, diagnostic tests, and then a portion of that would be allocated by the WHO on the basis of public health needs, so where there is an emergency going on somewhere. So the idea is, well, ideally it could be a win-win in both needs, and I think the reason why it's become so contentious, but also is sort of the crowning jewel of this agreement, if you can talk about it that way, is that it increases things that we want. On one hand, it would increase the pool of available information so that when an emergency arises, we have more countermeasures to provide. And the pharmaceutical industries are interested in that because they can make products quickly. They have rapid access to a wide range of pathogens in circulation. And on the other hand, it deals with the problem of equitable access in that there's a sense from a lot of countries that if they're providing free access to pathogen information, which are their genetic sovereign resources under a lot of ABS mechanisms, then at least that way they would have access to the products that are used with providing that information. So it's a fair exchange here, and there is general agreement, thankfully, within the INB that these things should be provided on equal footing. That's about the only level of agreement we have so far. Everything else kind of falls apart. So there is a lot of discussion around, what is the minimum threshold for a product allocation that would actually provide equity in a public health emergency. That number's fallen down to 5% recently, which a lot of particularly low-income countries think is just a token gesture, and they're going to have to rely on all the other kind of bilateral means to end up with products in an emergency. And we've seen the pharmaceutical industry come a little bit further along the road, I think associated with their change of chief executive, but that's another story, to accepting what a floor of product allocation for free or at low cost actually would look like. But the discussion at the moment is like how much of this is achievable right now. The pandemic agreement draft kind of kicks the can down the road to working out the details, but there's a question about, is benefit sharing one of the details we agree at a later stage? And a lot of countries are like, no, because if we want to achieve, if PAB system is the mechanism through which we actually receive tangible equity at a percentage, then that cannot be left to negotiating down the road as these positions get gradually watered down over time. Unfortunately, that is a trend that we've been seeing, is, positions on equity are watered down over time. But in the absence of a PABS mechanism, we just have this patchwork of national ABS schemes that the industry doesn't really like doing because they need a bunch of lawyers to work out how to work. But at the same time, it would limit the pool of available pathogen information, so that when the next COVID comes around, we have ample tools that we can tweak and make quickly to provide to the world. So that's really why this has been such a big sticking point in these negotiations.
So I'll do the benefit of giving you your CLE credit by reading from your most recent draft. And this is from text. They have green, which is kind of parties generally agree. There's yellow text where they're kind of coming closer. This is in white text, which means there's simply no agreement over it. And it says, in the event of a pandemic emergency, contribution by manufacturers to WHO for allocation and distribution through the GSCL network of their, in brackets, reasonable real-time production, brackets, at least 20% of real-time production and a little less than 10% of production provided free of charge, and 10% production at not-for-profit prices, up to 20% of safe, quality, efficacious vaccines, therapeutics, diagnostics needed during pandemic emergency on a free of charge basis or at a non-for-profit or affordable prices, recognizing that flexibility is important in negotiating in the above reference range with all manufacturers. Such products shall be made available for use on the basis of public health risk and need, and upon request with particular attention to the needs of developing countries. That's what's at dispute. But, let's put this in context. There is not uniformly across the world the same level of need. And the parties that may be sharing and uploading the pathogens or developing the materials for contribution simply may not be the ones that actually have the need for these medical countermeasures. So if I said to you, we have a racism problem, let's agree to solve 10% of that problem by sharing things more equitably. You would laugh. This is not a sensible way of approaching a worldwide health problem. But if the alternative is we're not going to share anything because we don't have to and we have national sovereignty, then you would say, well, maybe something is better than nothing. And that's essentially where the negotiation is. And even the something can't be agreed right now. So now the question is it better to get some agreement and push off the something, whatever that something is, until later? That's the kind of overall negotiating structure. It also has a history. So again, we have access and benefit sharing agreements now from all sorts of different areas. The most important, of course, is the Convention on Biological Diversity and the Nagoya Protocol. Remember that, that was coming out of a concern over biopiracy. And let's assume that somebody's, improperly exported by acquiring without authority some rice from country A. It may be that the rice in country A actually originally developed in country B. It's also available in country B, but under the terms of the Nagoya Protocol, the benefit sharing is only supposed to go back to country A if some company has now not biopirated, but with authority, obtained legal access to that information. The system makes no sense. Because why should country B lose any benefits from the commercial development of something that originated in their country just because somebody acquired those resources somewhere else? This goes back to the 1959 UN Permanent Declaration on Sovereignty over Natural Resources, because our DNA and the DNA in nature up until that time had been thought of as worldwide common heritage resources, things that the world needed, things that everyone had a right to. And therefore, one can think in terms of common heritage resources. If everyone has a right to them, maybe everyone has a right to the benefits that flow from access to them. But that's not how national sovereignty works, and that's not how these treaties work. So once again, we're stuck in the Treaty of Westphalia system, which makes no sense with global health emergencies, with pandemics that can go from one boundary to the next. What I love trying to encourage people is, if you really think you should have ownership over your pandemic resources, well, remember that pandemic disease vectors are really like wild animals. And under Roman law and up till the present, if your wild animal, feri naturae, gets loose, it's a strict liability offense for the damage it caused. So let's just make every country that supplies the pandemic resources liable for all of the worldwide harm that it causes. You can see the problem, right? We have a worldwide system that simply doesn't function in a global community. And there's no way out of this problem short of world government, and we're not going to get it. So that's why Pedro's going to tell us what we can get in these negotiations.
So yes, Pedro, how do we move the needle specifically on access and benefit sharing? So how do we move the needle? So Josh Left is on a world apart. So how do we?
How we come to the world together.
I'll use marginally. How do we move the needle specifically in the context of access and benefit sharing negotiations?
I appreciate your putting me on the spot, Joshua. That's kind of you. And
Somebody's
well,
got
just adding up on what Joshua, Matthew, and Alex already said, and to further complete this description, right, of what the current PAB system envisages and how it's supposed to work. So one way, I think one of the main concerns, particularly from countries of lower and middle income that were let's say left behind during the COVID-19 pandemic in the distribution of medical goods, and where they want things to change in the future, in future pandemics. So on the one hand, Alex already explained how one of the main pillars of the strategy is the rapid and effective provision of pathogenic samples and genome sequencing data whenever a new disease or already known disease with pandemic potential emerges somewhere in the world. If the current pandemic agreement and its published and agreed upon text gets approved, the idea would be that they would now be obliged to provide these pathogen examples and genome sequencing data to the WHO laboratory network. Currently, there exists no such obligation. It's all of this works on a voluntary basis. So if a state suddenly says, as it happened with Indonesia in 2007, we don't want to share our genetic resources or our natural resources in the case of biological resources in the case of pathogen samples with the WHO. That's it. There's no way to force them, and there's no legal means to oblige them. So this would be on the one hand, one of the pillars of this new pathogen access and benefit sharing that will make us all safer in future pandemics. But the other pillar has to do with what was just said on the distribution, distributive justice issues. So what can countries expect in return if they're expected to collaborate and contribute by providing their pathogenic samples and genome sequencing data. And by the way, I think these two, it's difficult to conflate the two of them under a single legal obligation, but I won't go into the details. So what can they expect in return? And that's where this benefit sharing comes into play. And actually the way it works, as Joshua already read the draft text that is published, would also be through the signing of contracts between the WHO and the potential would-be manufacturers, right? Private law contracts and the applicable law will be decided by them that are meant to give effectiveness to this obligation. So it's not just a matter of, strictly speaking, public international law, where yes, states will be committed to ensure that private actors fulfill their end of the bargain. It's private actors themselves, the ones that will have to sign those contracts with the WHO. And this indeed, it could eventually lead to litigation in case they do not fulfill their obligation to provide a percentage of either real-time production or best efforts to provide such a percentage. This is still under negotiation, but this is meant to be the strategy that guarantees to countries that were not satisfied with the way things went during the COVID-19 pandemic, that indeed in the future things will be better in the sense that there will be legal tools to make this a reality. But again, it's technically complex, and I have doubts of whether they will be able to polish all the details before the deadline expires, because it is indeed quite a complex formula, multi-dimensional legal formula that they want to agree upon. Thank you.
And before I solicit questions from the audience, I actually would like for us to just talk briefly about contracts. Because one of the things that to me was striking during COVID-19 is that some of these contractual forms actually were used by the World Health Organization reactively to try, remember, COVAX and procurement of pandemic vaccines. So actually, the World Health Organization was playing the game that private companies and sovereign countries play, which is to contract even at pre-production stage for the acquisition of X percentage or number of vaccine doses or what have you, right? So WHO actually uses contractual pathways with Gavi, right? When it enters into procurement agreements on a regular basis, did so or tried to do so during the pandemic through the use of COVAX, whose nature has also evolved throughout all of this. And yet that's exactly the same legal tool that countries use to undermine these kinds of goals, right? To secure sometimes excessive amounts of product for their own constituencies. So how do contracts play into all of this? Are they likely to be, a private slash sovereign tool to undermine some of these goals? Can we think creatively about this? So have we learned anything from COVID-19? I guess that's what I'm asking for whoever wants to take it up.
Why don't I take it first then? So this is also tied up with technology transfer. And, if you start not with the efforts of the World Health Organization, which try to encourage voluntary sharing through contractual means, through its COVID technology access pool, but you think about the private entities in the various countries that I had mentioned, developing their technologies. The governments were heavily involved in de-risking those technology developments. They did that in a number of ways. The most important is by guaranteeing market purchasing if products were brought to market that could be made available. I mean, this was big money and I mean, sadly, the amount of money paled, even though it was big money by comparison to the worldwide economic losses. So if you thought about how much money should the government have been spending, or governments around the world spending, they actually should have been spending a lot more. But, you know, if you follow the money, the governments provided assurances of money, which drove technology development and clinical trials and manufacturing scale up and all that. The second way they de-risked production was through measures like in the US, the Defense Production Act, to assure that, don't worry, I'll get back to contracts.
But leave some room for questions for the audience, okay?
So the second way they did it was by developing and ordering supply chains to produce and generate and give to the countermeasures manufacturers the supplies that they needed. Government basically took control over the economy. The third way is that through contracts with these companies to produce by and for the government, through various mechanisms, focusing mostly on the US government, but I think it's true in many of the other countries, basically provide immunity from intellectual property to lawsuits and other types of liabilities, including that we have a vaccine liability immunity and a fund to compensate victims, things like that. So the governments, national governments were heavily involved in the research and development, manufacturing and distribution with immunities of all of these products, as well as pre-purchasing for their own use, which gets to the equitable concern. Could these governments have contractually conditioned those same purchases to distribute more equitably around the world? Absolutely. But having bought up the supply originally using all of these measures, they were not about to send, in some cases, as I said, there were supply chain issues, but they were not about to send these products to help out the rest of the world, even if that would have led to lower worldwide disease burdens and lower actual deaths in the long run, even to their own citizens. It's just not politically possible. I think it actually is politically possible with leadership, but that's a different issue. So there are any number of things that the World Health Organization could do in its contracts, even under a access and benefit sharing system, to assure that what gets developed with monies that are being provided, as well as all of the national governments, actually then follow through to assure access. But you're going to have to get past the political problems. And how we get past the political problems is something no one has figured out yet. Hopefully, these guys will tell you how we get past those political problems.
Fair issue. So just briefly on the role that contracts have to play in this regard. So as you're all very aware, companies are not actors in international law context. So how do you bind a company under a treaty regime? So the idea is this sort of based on the PIP framework. It's a pandemic influenza preparedness framework from the WHO. It's a non-binding instrument, but it uses binding contracts as a way of committing manufacturers to supply certain types of benefits. It's called an SMTA2, a bit boring, but it's a way for companies to negotiate what kind of benefits, how much are we going to give WHO for the benefits that we've accessed through the PIP framework, which is exclusively pandemic strains of influenza. But that idea has been sort of adapted and is going to ideally be built into the PABS mechanism. The problem with purchasing in a context like COVID, where you don't have binding rules like that, is that WHO ends up in a bidding war with wealthy countries. And you saw that exactly happen with the COVAX mechanism, which was set up to essentially support low-income countries, and 92 of them, to purchase vaccines. And so they kind of pooled purchasing power there. But what happened is, wealthy countries essentially bypassed the mechanism and entered into bilateral deals with manufacturers anyway. So we had this mechanism set up that just was no longer the big purchaser that it could have been at the beginning. And so having something like a PAB system with like individual contracts set up with manufacturers is supposed to just give a little bit more purchasing power to WHO so it can supply an equitable amount of vaccines and distribute them.
SMTA is Standard Material Transfer Agreement.
I might defer so that we have a little time for questions, if that's right.
Yeah.
I appreciate that. So I will now collect questions from the audience.
Wait, Pedro, did you want to chime in on contracts?
No, I already
Okay.
said what I wanted to say on the topic. Thank you so much.
All right, so do we have any questions for the panel in general or a specific panelist?
I have a general question. It's not about the pandemic or the emergency, but I have a question about children's rights. Feel free to answer the questions, anyone, it's fine. So following what happened in the US, like 26 of the states already ban or restrict the gender affirming surgeries treatments for minors. Is there a chance that we're gonna have something internationally like regulation regarding this topic?
My guess is that that's not high on the priorities list of international negotiators.
I feel like that the root to that problem is probably under the right to health, so the international human rights frameworks. And the special rapporteur on the right to health has written extensively about the rights of sexual and reproductive health care for kids, trans kids. So it probably wouldn't be through this forum, it would be through the processes.
Any other questions from the audience? So here's what I would propose. We have about 5 minutes left, so I'll call this our final lightning round. So is there anything I have not asked you, but you're dying to share with us? Or if not, what's your more, your most urgent concern and hope moving forward?
So I may kick off with just kind of 2 closing things. So the first is I want to stress just how complex and difficult these negotiations have been. So I work in planetary health, actually. I don't study life on Mars, that's not what I do, but more how looking at planetary health, a systems thinking transdisciplinary approach to leverage building a coherent and cohesive international framework against international legal fragmentation and leveraging that for the well-being of people and the planet. And in practicing that and looking at planetary health through that lens, just going back to access and benefit sharing for a brief moment, you have the Convention on Biological Diversity with its own access and benefit sharing situation. You have PABS and what might come of that. You have the Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction Agreement and Marine Genetic Resources and what the mechanism would look like under that. And then you have the Plant Genetic Resources Treaty at the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, all trying to identify and negotiate this same issue in their own silos. And that alone, and looking at that in relation to global public health and global planetary well-being, shows how complex these are, but how pertinent they are and how important they are to build coherence around in order to promote the world order that Josh was talking about, that maybe one day hopefully we can have, where we have a global governance structure that can cohesively and coherently negotiate and promote and advance these issues and solutions to these issues. And then the second thing, being someone from the US, I think it's pertinent to talk about that elephant in the room that Josh was referencing. There's a big chance in the next 2 weeks that there could be a large shift in these negotiations. And if the United States does pull out of the World Health Organization, I think we're going to go one of maybe 3 routes. We're going to see a shift in the dimensions of the multilateral order, particularly around pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response. We might see a breakdown of the multilateral order to a certain extent, or we might see a status quo. And I think particularly in the pandemic treaty negotiations, as Alex mentioned, that's not negotiable at this point. We can't have a status quo of what we have, because the next pandemic is not an if, it's a when. And that's really pertinent and really important to consider. So I think a large question moving forward on the pandemic treaty negotiations and pandemic preparedness and response writ large, including the international health regulations, is how do we govern global health within the new multilateral order and the new multilateral system? I think it's an important question for those who do global health law to keep in mind in particular, because I believe there is a duty to care there to a certain extent, and a duty to protect and defend global public health and global public well-being. And I think we need to figure out what that looks like moving forward in the next few decades.
Thank you. Can I go to Pedro next?
Sure, thanks so much. And I actually share Matthew's assessment of the potential outcomes and the perils, right, that lie ahead. I think the status quo, by that we mean what going back to the way things were during the COVID-19 pandemic, and to expect the next pandemic to look the same in terms of the norms and obligations is unacceptable, particularly after 3 years of harsh, heavy negotiations by so many delegations in Geneva, including delegations of countries that are resource constrained and do not have the capacity really to devote so much personnel to going into the nitty-gritty details and technical complexities involved in such an agreement. I think this would be indeed quite a blow to the trust in the multilateral system, including, of course, the World Health Organization, because if we cannot get the international community of states to agree on how to face a common threat like a pandemic, right, which is global by definition, what can we then expect in terms of all the other challenges, including, for instance, climate change, of course, which is an existential challenge? I think it would be a major blow. But at the same time, there's also hope, at least at the World Health Summit. I don't know if Matthew shares this impression. There is some optimism surrounding the negotiations of the pandemic agreement that at least the minimum common denominator, which may disappoint some, but at least a minimum common denominator is possible, so that we can then build upon in the future more detailed rules on how to foster equity, how to improve prevention through a One Health approach, and other issues that require further political negotiations and debates. So I think there's some room for optimism, and we'll keep an eye on the ongoing negotiations to see whether they do indeed meet these expectations of reaching a minimum common denominator. Thanks so much.
That was a very quickly to echo those comments, Pedro's and Matthew's as well, and just say, well, there is some space for optimism. I mean, if we think about from global health law perspective, there's only one binding treaty on global health at the moment. Well, the International Health Regulations is a binding treaty, but the only other treaty that's ever been negotiated under WHO is on Framework Convention on Tobacco Control and rules like that. So I think that the fact that there is consensus that we need a strong international rules-based order for things like pandemics is something that we can be quite relatively optimistic about, just to avoid something that was so, pandemics upend our lives in so many different ways. And the fact that there is international consensus that we need, rules and norms to prevent problems like that happen again is good. And it doesn't end with the adoption of a treaty. Like the idea is they're going to set up a conference of the parties that behave in a similar way to the conference of the parties under the UNFCCC, where they'll continue to create norms, either soft law or hard law norms, to kind of propel more cooperation and more solidarity, so we don't have something as awful as COVID.
So I'll just end because, I agree with everything that my co-panelist said, with two thoughts. The first is the problem isn't going to go away. And the second, since Anna didn't ask me who my favorite rock group was, I won't tell you that, but I will say, listen to Bobby McFerrin, don't worry, be happy. Right? Just the problems won't go away, but you have to just move on.
On that note, thanks to all the panelists. Thank you for attending today. Thank you for joining me. Just thanking our wonderful panelists.
Yeah. Thanks so much, and we'll be in touch. Take care. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Yeah, okay. For a moment, I thought.
Oh, yeah, we probably should. We lost Pedro. Oh, okay. Fantastic.
Yeah.
Right.
Actually.
Yeah, it is me. Yeah, but I'm also taking.
That's the international stuff.